Hi, my name is Lila and I'm the Mini Witch. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this week's video, we are talking about my biggest undertaking yet, Crono from Black Rose Wars, including NMM, ESNMM, OSL, and more. This miniature was a lot. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I'm still not entirely happy with it, but I learned so freaking much along the way. And I'm so excited to have the opportunity to share my experience and knowledge with you, and hopefully teach you a thing or two along the way. Because of the complexity of this model, I'm going to be breaking this video down into two parts. First is NMM, and then the second video is everything else. So be sure to watch out next week for part 2 of this series. Before we get too far into this, I want to let you know that I painted this miniature to be the big final boss to my 2-year Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So if you're expecting this to look like Crono from Black Rose Wars, that's not what this is. So just to get that out of the way. By the way, we kicked butt and saved the world. I started this miniature with a digital mockup, and would continue to work on this model digitally throughout this process. But at the start, I'm just focusing on the color and color scheme of this model. My plan was to paint him a humanoid color with a purplish silver metal for the armor. Then do red for the veins and wires to make it look more biological and less sci-fi. As you can see, I also plan to paint this little human figure a human color as well. But things evolve, and it's totally fine if you don't stick with your original sketch. It's just a place to give you a place to start. The one thing that I wish that I had done in this digital mockup was draw in my SENMM. As a quick side note, SENMM is first of all a mouthful, but second of all, it stands for Sky, Earth, Non-Metallic Metals. So what that means is that the non-metallic metals are going to reflect the environment around them. So, Sky, Earth, non-metallic metal. I decided to do this on a whim because if I was going big, why not go really big? And it ended up being a bit of a problem later on. I could have saved myself a lot of time and energy if I had just painted this in. Even once I had decided that I was going to be doing SENMM, should have gone back to the digital mockup and added it in. Would have saved me a lot of time. I began this model by applying Zenithal highlights. To keep things easier on myself, I decided that this model would be lit with a neutral lighting. What this means is that once I figured out the non-metallic metal on one side of the model, it was going to be perfectly reflected on the other side of the model. If I had a more directional lighting source, I would have had to figure out what the NMM would have looked like on one side and then what the NMM would look like on a different side as well. So, save myself a little bit of time by just doing neutral lighting. Zenithal highlights are only going to give me a general idea of the highlights and shadows. Oh no, you're causing trouble! Zenithal highlights will only be marginally help. You did not just go right back to the mischief you were causing. Zenithal highlights are only going to be helpful for the general highlights and shadows of this model, and even more marginally helpful when it comes to NMM. Next up was examining reference photos online. Since this model is so unusual with its shark fins, I went out of my way to look for other examples of this model. I didn't find anyone who had painted NMM, and honestly, I'm okay with that because it didn't make me biased to any sort of certain look or feel. But I did find several true metallic metal versions online. The photos I found most helpful were by heroes and bosses on Imgur. So quick shout out to you for posting those, extremely useful to me. There are several areas on the armor of this model that follow what one would expect for highlights and shadows, but there are also a few areas that don't. Specifically, I'm noticing the darkness here and here. These areas are what is going to make this look metallic. Here are the colors I used for this miniature. The armor is painted with black, purple, chestnut, yellow, and green ink from Scale 75's Intensity set, white ink from Daler Rowney, medium gray from Vallejo Game Air, and cloud gray from Reaper, and also black and white. The SENMM was created with Mud Brown from Reaper and Arabic Flesh from Scale 75. Then I began to airbrush my NMM. In my head, this was going to save me a lot of time, especially since my model is so large. But in the long run, I don't think so. At least, not this time around. But then again, I learned so much that maybe if I were to try this again, I would have better results on the second time. But here's what I did. I'm starting by mixing my airbrush colors in paper cups, using black, purple, and white ink, as well as medium gray airbrush paint. I recommend mixing all of the colors you plan to use in your airbrush at the same time in separate cups. Mixing them all at once will ensure they match. You should also mix more than you need in case you need to go back in and fix any mistakes. I'm starting by painting the dark shadowed areas first, because you want to paint from the back forwards. Here you can see I'm following the shadows created by the zenithal highlights as well as the areas that I pointed out previously on my reference photo. Here I'm adding my midtones to help blend out my shadows, once again following my reference photo and zenithal highlights. When you're blending colors like this, you want to use diluted paint and a soft touch. You want to do several thin passes with your airbrush. Don't try to do it all at once. That's how you'll make this appear seamless. Now I'm adding my highlights, utilizing the same process as before. A pretty big part of this will get covered later, but I want to go over the process anyway. As you can see, I'm applying my highlights exactly where I want them, and then blending them out into the midtones. You might need to go back and forth between your highlights, midtones, and shadows until everything is smooth. Here I began adding my SENMM, focusing on the areas that face downwards on my model. For this miniature, I'm only painting the ground, which is going to be a warm tannish brown. I'm only adding ground into the reflections for two reasons. One, I'm adding this on a whim and really didn't want to have to paint in the sky. But second, and perhaps only rationalizing reason one, this battle is taking place in the wastes of Limbo, a demiplane of pure chaos, where the sky is literal nothingness and your character has to make a wisdom saving throw if they look at the sky too long. So, no sky for me. When painting SENMM, we have to come up with something easier to say. Consider what area the armor will be reflecting. Are there rolling hills or trees or mountains? What color is the sky? Understanding the terrain around your NMM is what's going to make this the easiest. The safest bet is that if the armor is angled downwards, it should reflect the ground. If it's angled upwards, it should reflect the sky. And if it's straight vertical, imagine it like a mirror that should reflect what's parallel to it. I'm going to be doing an entire video on SENMM, and I'm going to have a better name by then. And when that video is available, it will be linked here. As I was looking at the mini, it just didn't feel right. I wasn't sure what was wrong, but it was off. After looking at reference photos, I eventually realized that this large highlight on the thigh wasn't looking metallic. In my NMM video, I talked about how looking at true metallic model references is a great way to find the shadows of your NMM, but it doesn't really work to find the highlights. By following this reference photo, I have indeed added highlights to this model, but it doesn't look metallic. It looks more like stone or some other organic material. So I went off to do a digital mock-up, playing with the areas of darkness until it looked metallic. Lesson 1. Dark lines are what helps round areas look metallic. Imagine your area either being bisected by a dark line or trisected with 3 sections of bright highlight and 2 dark lines in between each section of highlight. These intense darks are what makes metal look round. Once I was happy with my sketch, it was time to recreate it on my miniature. But instead of doing it with my airbrush, I decided that it would be easier to do it by hand. Lesson 2. While airbrushing NMM would totally work if you want a super smooth NMM appearance, it just isn't my style. I should have considered what I wanted my model to look like before I started. Having a visionary goal in mind will help you know what process you should do to be able to reach that goal. Since I prefer having textured NMM, it was sort of silly of me to start out with the airbrush. Next time, I'll block in my reflections and then through a combination of layering and glazing, blend out those areas till it's as smooth or as textured as I want. By hand, I'm mixing cloud gray with a touch of purple ink, then creating a shadow by adding that mixture to black, and a highlight by adding that same mixture to white. To create textured NMM, I'm using short strokes to quickly block in my highlights and shadows. To blend out this area, I'm painting a gradation of rows of strokes. To me, the texture makes the armor appear more worn instead of a perfect parade style finish. It also has the added benefit of being a lot easier to do, and it doesn't need to be perfectly blended. The consistency of this paint should be a very thin down layer. We definitely want the strokes to be visible, but we also want them to overlap and blend together. I also take some time to work on my ESNMM on the bracers, playing with the dark lines once again until it looks metallic. Even with these updates, it still didn't feel right. I couldn't figure it out until after staring at dozens of reference photos that I eventually realized my problem. My reflections and shadows in my round parts of the armor weren't rounded. It sounds stupid. I had never really considered the bottom of my reflections and what shape they take. I realized that if your metal is round, your darkness and highlights also need to end in round. Lesson 3. The edges of your darks should match the shape of your element. Round element, round dark. This was a breakthrough moment for me, and I feel like it really helped me sell the NMM on this miniature. Next, I'm re-examining my reference photo and painting more intense highlights, specifically on the curves of his back pieces. The curves of the piece made it very difficult to paint, as it was impossible to find realistic references to shark fin armor. First, I'm using black ink in my airbrush to darken down the center of each panel. Using my airbrush for this subtle change is a lot easier than trying to blend out paint. Then I'm applying my highlights with my usual short strokes, slowly building up my brights by layering glaze consistency paint over and over as I move towards the tips of the panels. But per usual, it wasn't there yet. But onto the blade. I'm painting over part of the blade with latex so I can paint over it with my airbrush. I will eventually paint over all of this, but again, I think it's important you know where I started. Even so, it still didn't look right. A lot of this was just it not looking right. So I hope that adding some more detail would help bring it all together. So I took some time, did a bunch of lining and a bunch of edge highlighting. focusing on the nicks and cuts and bolts and doing all of the little details that I really hoped would bring it all together. Next is adding in more interest with color contrast. I'm mixing green, yellow, and black together to go into the shadows of this armor and attempt to add some color contrast. I'm a very strong proponent of color contrast in the shadows, and I think that it is the secret ingredient to all mini painting. Colors are not single blocks, only changed by white and black. Instead, they are rich in variety, perhaps not as disparate as what we can make them when we're mini painting, but that is a privilege that we have, that we can accomplish such things with mini painting. This is the first time that I began to feel like I was going in the right direction, but it still wasn't done yet. So I went to the internet for guidance. And Naomi from Sword and Steel was amazingly helpful and went over my entire miniature, telling me what areas looked metallic, what areas might look metallic depending on everything else around them, and what areas did not look metallic. Having these areas pointed out to me, even though they were right in front of my face, was extremely helpful and opened my eyes to help me know what I needed to do to make this model realistic. Building a painting community is very important, and I highly recommend that you do so. Whether that means you're making friends on Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, or even Discord, it's so important to be able to get feedback from other people. If you don't know how to make friends on the internet, go to a Facebook page, make a post saying that you're looking for painting friends, and I guarantee that people will comment who are also looking for painting friends, and you'll be able to start your own community. In frustration, I moved on to painting the blade, one of the last elements I needed to work on. I had done a simple gradation previously, but since the blade was so large, it really wasn't working. After looking at more reference photos, I decided that I needed to add more lights and darks to the blade, specifically around the curve. I started by adding a very dark purple at the top of the blade, and then through a combination of wet blending and glazing, did an alternating dark light pattern down the curve of the blade, and then slowed that down to broader bands down the straight edge of the blade. Don't forget to make these edges of the highlights and shadows curved as well. I took a final look at the back plates and decided that there needed to be a highlight at the curve of each fin and a small shadow along the side of each fin. I began by applying a dark line across the fin, then wet blending it out to better match my base color. With the fins complete, it was really starting to look like armor. The faces on the armor were probably the most difficult part. Naomi pointed out that they didn't look metallic, but how am I supposed to know what a metallic face is going to look like? And then it dawned on me. Masks. Specifically, masquerade masks. I bet I could totally find a fully silver metallic face mask. And so that's what I decided to look for. Finding a mask that was the full face was a bit tricky, but eventually I did come up with a reference photo. For the pauldron, I began by placing a dark stripe down the front of the face, carrying it up along the inside edge of each eyebrow. Then I added a highlight in the center of each dark area at the curve of the eyebrow to create an alternating pattern of dark, light, dark. Next, I added a line of darkness down each side of the face. Then I'm blending out the highlights on the eyebrows and into the surrounding shadows. Following the reference photo, I also add highlights under the nose on the side of the Cupid's bow and a highlight to the nasolabial fold. Lastly, I added a strip of darkness down the bridge of the nose. For the main face, I began by placing my dark highlight down the center of the mask. Then blending that into highlights on either side of the mask. I did the same thing with the eyebrow areas, dark in the middle and highlights on the sides. Then I added that same dark line down the eyebrows and added a shadow to the creases where the brows bulged and furrowed. Next, I'm adding bright white to the edge of the nose and cheeks and placing the same dark line down the bridge of the nose. Then I continue to increase the highlights on the forehead. Since I want the face to be one of the main focuses, I used pure white to draw the eyes to this location. Before I call this mini done, I need to do a little more work on the SENMM on the faces. To make them look more metallic, I began adding highlights to the rounded edges to break them up into the alternating pattern we talked about previously. For these highlights, I don't have a reference photo, I'm just winging it based on my understanding of NMM. Overall, I'm very happy with how the faces turned out. In the end, I am very happy with this miniature. Honestly, I could continue to work on this forever and maybe never be done. There are a few areas I'm not going to talk about, but I had to put it down eventually. I feel like I learned so much while working on this miniature, and that's part of why I had to keep going back and redoing certain areas. But I really feel like I got the hang of NMM on this one. I hope that this video was useful and helpful to you. Let me know in the comments, would you be willing to face this BBEG at the end of your campaign? If you like what I do here, you can support me a bunch of ways. Patreon, Instagram, subscribe, you know the drill. If nothing else, I hope to see you on the next video or on my Instagram, and check out next week's video to see the rest of this model.